Hello, I'm Scott Nycum. I am a retired banker. I worked at J.P. Morgan for 41 years and retired in 2016, I think it is, 2015. I first encountered Colorado baseball in 1991. At that time, I was with J.P. Morgan's private bank in New York, working in 9 West 57th Street. And my responsibilities then were to oversee J.P. Morgan's private bank business outside of where we had offices in the U.S., so outside of New York, California, and Florida. So it would be the rest of the country. And it was a Thursday afternoon in 1991 when all of a sudden I was told that we had 2 visitors, Paul Jacobs and Steve Kurtz. I consider Paul the true father of baseball in Colorado, and Paul and Steve are now among my very best friends. But apparently they had been meeting with another financial institution earlier the day, and the objective of that meeting was to tie down a commitment for the remaining $40 million of the $97 million that the owners of Colorado baseball needed to pay Bill White of the National League in order to get the franchise. And they came away from that meeting feeling a little uncomfortable about that firm's commitment. And so they decided, since they had a few hours before their plane back to Denver, they would just knock on the door of J.P. Morgan. So anyway, of course, by that time, I'd never heard of Colorado baseball. I'd never heard of Paul or Steve. But as soon as they talked about what they were here to discuss, I brought in a fellow named Ken Dale. Ken Dale was a senior financial analyst who knew everything about baseball that anybody at J.P. Morgan knew. Because Ken had just been in the middle of the mandate that J.P. Morgan had to sell the Baltimore Orioles. And he'd also just done a valuation of the Kansas City Royals as part of the valuation of the Kauffman estate, because Mr. Kauffman had recently died. So he came in, joined the meeting. I included 2 other colleagues, Fabrice Brownroot and Jerry Renane, who were part of my team. And we looked at the projections, and I turned to Ken and said, okay, what kind of haircut are you going to give these projections? 30%, 40%, which, you know, is what bankers do. And he said, actually, these projections look pretty conservative. I'm not sure they need a haircut. Well, I nearly fell out of my chair. But at that point, I turned to Paul and Steve and said, could you gentlemen cancel your flight back to Denver and maybe stay the weekend? And let's work and see if we can get to yes here. And it was an extraordinary moment, because I will tell you, 6 months before, 6 months after today, we would not have been able to get to yes as fast as we ended up doing. And to make a long story short, by the following Tuesday or Wednesday, we, J.P. Morgan, had come up with a commitment for the full $40 million. And that was the last piece in the puzzle to achieve the money that was needed to get the franchise to come to Denver. And you know, I'm very proud of my colleagues at J.P. Morgan. I'm very proud and impressed with the quality of the discussion that Paul and Steve brought to the table to make it easy for us to get to yes. So that was my first introduction to Colorado baseball, going back to 1991.
At that time, Colorado and the Denver metro area was in a pretty deep, prolonged recession. A lot of our economy had been based on the oil and gas industry, which was kind of in the toilet at that particular point in time. Did that make the decision-making for J.P. Morgan Chase any more difficult, or?
No, not really. Honestly, we didn't have much activity then in Denver. We obviously didn't have an office in Denver until much later, 2001. And it was really looking at the opportunity on its own merits. And looking at the numbers, feeling that, in fact, this made good economic sense for the owners of Colorado baseball, for the city of Denver, but also for J.P. Morgan as far as a loan was concerned. So it was really on a standalone basis.
So when you reached agreement a few days later, was that a firm agreement with them?
Yeah, it was a firm agreement. Internally, we said if we could, we'd like to sell down the $40 million to $20 million. And in fact, we did convince two other local banks to come in at $10 million each. But we took responsibility for the full $40 million and committed to it in writing, so that then Steve and Paul and the owners could go to the National League with something that was firm.
So then, did you start watching the process a lot more closely?
Yeah, you bet, you bet. And my colleagues who I brought into the meeting, Fabrice and Jerry, really did a lot of the day-to-day work. I stayed very closely involved along the way. And, there were various twists and turns after the original commitment.
So what happened when Monas had his problems and dropped out? Did that have any impact?
Well, I was on vacation, and I got up early in the morning, I think it was a Saturday morning, with my cup of coffee and read the newspaper, and I saw the headlines about Monas being indicted for embezzlement and I don't know what else. And that was an uncomfortable moment for me. So I quickly called Paul, and he filled me in to the extent that he legally could. And throughout the next few months, I stayed very close to Paul and Steve. And you can always judge somebody, the quality of somebody, when things don't go well. And working through these challenges with Paul and Steve impressed me even further about both of them. And it was very reassuring. Nobody panicked, certainly nobody at J.P. Morgan panicked, but we knew we had to work through this change in management because the character of who we do business with at J.P. Morgan is very important. So, it was a case of all's well that ends well, but there were a few uncomfortable moments before we got to that end point.
Well, at that particular point in time, I was banking with Chase, and I was really shocked when I went into the bank and saw a life-size cutout of Don Baylor, and that Chase was advertising itself as the bank of the Colorado Rockies. Did you have something to do with that sponsorship? And
no, not at all. In fact, in the 90s, Chase was a competitor to J.P. Morgan, and Chase acquired J.P. Morgan many years later, around 2004. So we were very much independent, and Chase's focus was mostly on the retail side of things, whereas I was representing the private bank side of things at J.P. Morgan, which focused on ultra-high net worth people and families and not-for-profits. And J.P. Morgan had no retail presence or, frankly, any retail expertise. So that was primarily driven by Chase and the management of Chase, separate from J.P. Morgan.
So how long did J.P. Morgan stay involved for providing money for the...
A relatively short time after the Monas incident, because I'm forgetting the exact timeline, but some months after that, I would say less than a year, Citibank came in and provided a substantial line of credit for all of baseball. And the Rockies used that line of credit to take out the loans that we had provided. And that was fine. I think everybody was very happy with the outcome. And from our point of view, we were very happy to make the commitment to help bring baseball to Colorado. We were very happy to be repaid in a timely fashion, and we were very happy to have gained a number of friends and a knowledge of the Denver community that we would not have had without this involvement. So, it was a case of all's well that ends well.
So you moved to Denver. Are you a baseball fan?
Yes, we moved to Denver in 2001 I was asked to open an office here. And I go to the home opening game every year with Paul Jacobs. He's kind enough to invite me. And with both Steve and Paul, we often go to spring training, which we're going to be doing in this March. So we're very avid fans. And my wife can tell you all there is to know about every player. I'm not quite there, but I'm getting there.
Did you have that interest before you did this deal with Paul?
Growing up, I had an interest in baseball, but I was never passionate about a team, except for the Baltimore Orioles for a period of time, as I became passionate about the Rockies. And, you know, I'm excited about the season coming up.
From a banker's perspective, I know one of the challenges that Neil and I had when we were working on the bill and we certainly didn't know for sure how much a stadium would cost. We certainly didn't know what the franchise fee was going to be, and certainly what it would cost to build a team. Did that make you as a banker nervous at all? That those things weren't set in stone yet?
Yeah, no, not really. We had a level of confidence that was pretty high that the city, which is a sports-loving city, would figure out a way to make this work. And being a banker, we always thought about, okay, worst case. Worst case is that our loan was covered many times over by the value of the franchise. And if in a worst case, the franchise didn't happen in Denver, or it did happen, but it needed to move for any reason, there was still considerable value there. So that was not an important consideration in our thinking.
You could have always stepped in and become the general manager.
Yeah, that would not have been good for anybody.
Well, I think one of the other things that Neil and I had worked on in terms of putting the bill together, we had set a target of certainly 0.1% on the sales tax, but we also had indicated that we had a target of 40 to 50% privatization, which means that they would sell the naming rights, that they would sell the advertising, they would sell parking. And as it turned out, the lease that was negotiated gave those revenues to the Colorado Rockies ownership. How much did that play a role in JP Morgan's confidence level in putting together the loan?
Yeah, now that was a factor. We felt confident in the loan because of the value of the franchise. But on top of that, the icing on the cake at the very least was we saw how many organizations were wanting to step up and be part of promoting themselves through the Rockies organizations. Now this was long before it was called Coors Field, but we saw firsthand the number of prominent companies that wanted to enter into contracts with Colorado baseball to provide their products and services. And that was part of the projections that led us to get to yes.
Well, we really appreciate your involvement. It's great you were there on that Thursday afternoon, and who knows what would have happened
Well,
if you hadn't.
Glad I was, and I'm glad that Ken Dale was there too, because it wouldn't have happened without Ken.
You know, there are so many things that Neil and I have also found to be serendipitous. Things that just seem to fall into place for all the challenges that we had in one area or another. And the JP Morgan story is another serendipitous, you know, couldn't have been planned in advance necessarily, but it turned out to be exactly right.
Yeah, who knew?
Who knew?
Right.
I know that Paul has told us several stories. I know Neil and I have several stories too of things that, you know, how would you know?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is
Well,
one of them.
It's been a wonderful thing for the city of Denver and for the fans of baseball, my family included. So, yeah, we're very pleased with the way everything worked out, again, after a few twists and turns.
Right.
Well, absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,